And I'm going to also, fantastic. I'm going to just also make you a co-host so that you can drive everything, Nikki, as you want to. And I'm going to just get...
Is it over to me now?
Just 1 second, I will give you the thumbs up in... Hang on. Just... You're... before you start, I was lucky enough to be Nikki's mentor, and I'm still working with her on this project. It has its roots actually in some work that I did many years ago. Some of you know that I was working in the bank in the whole sort of innovation and creativity space. And I met at a conference some years ago a wonderful man called Lindsay Collier, who was working for Kodak at the time. And he was engaged on a humor project. And he was being paid by Kodak to be funny. And he was also being paid by Kodak to broaden the basis of understanding about the importance of humor. And in fact, I recently sort of reached out to Lindsay and sort of re-linked in with him. He's, I think, basking somewhere in Florida now, but he's a quite inspirational character. But Nikki and I sort of talked about that. But now, Nikki, the floor is yours, because I'm really excited to hear about how you're helping to change the world. And
that's our school motto.
Indeed.
Sound down. Okay, thank you. So I'm Nikki Wyse, Head of Senior School at Pymble Ladies College in Sydney in Australia. I'd like to start this presentation just with an acknowledgement of country. From doing some research, I understand the term for this area is Cuyahoga, which is derived from the languages of the various Indigenous people who lived here for thousands of years. So I recognise those people for their careful stewardship of this land and acknowledge the thousands of Indigenous Americans who today call this area home. I also acknowledge the work that I completed was done on the traditional country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I acknowledge my local communities of the Guringai and Darug people as the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work. And I acknowledge both these living cultures for the role they play in maintaining life, language and culture in their regions. My project, I'm an English teacher as well, and my project wanted to explore if we expose my students to more comedic literature, if that would improve their outlook on the world, which is a little bit grim at the moment. So it was an interesting thing to pursue, and it's not finished. So I've had some lovely times reading funny books and some of the great comedians of English literature. And as the beautiful Mark Twain once wrote, the human race has only one really effective weapon, and that's laughter. I think we all know, especially for teenagers, the world's changing really quickly, and literature, as always, reflects those composers' concerns. As an English teacher, I have a really varied diet, a really varied textual diet, and I like to read across various genres. I also despair about the apparent drop in reading as a pastime for young people, which seems to have definitely died off in my school anyway. When I ask my students about why this is so, anecdotally they say they just don't see themselves as readers, they haven't got the time, and they actually don't like reading much. Despite the fact they said when they were younger, they actually counted reading as one of their favourite pastimes, and sort of feel they gave it up sometime around the start of high school, which in Australia is about the age of 12. Of course, many aspects of their lives change around this time, as well as the reading material to which they're exposed. I think we also need to consider, as the previous group was saying, the rising mental health issues and a perceived sense of hopelessness and gloom about the future for our young people, which ranges from climate change to a bleak economic outlook to war in Ukraine, gender issues, and just the list seems to be endless of things that's on their mind. Coupled with that, they are exposed to a diet of quite toxic social media, watching and sometimes even participating in some of the saddest and nastiest parts of life. At my school, the literature which we expose our senior girls to in their final years of school is often seriously tragic and really demanding to read. They're tough texts. And I've wondered about the possible connection between that and girls switching off reading and thinking that they don't like reading, or they see themselves as bad at reading. They have a negative self-assessment of themselves as reading. And I wondered, if reading something as challenging as Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, which is really sad and a really tough read, could actually make the teenagers think, I don't like reading, and I'm not good at it. So I did a bit of an audit of our reading list across the final 2 years of school, and this is just a pick of them. But they are, as you can see, it's dominated by tragedies and dystopic fiction, from right across the ages, from Frankenstein through Jane Eyre, and you can see the text on the screen there, quite despairing, some of it. And all of these writers wrote wonderful literature. I'm not saying they're not deserving of a place on our curriculum. There's no denying that these books touch on dark and subversive topics, which are really important and interesting to teenagers. It does allow them the opportunity to connect with ideas which fascinate them really through the stories of others, and builds empathy with other people's experiences in a really safe way. In some cases, it actually reflects some of their own experiences and lets students understand that their suffering is not unique and connects them in with others. They do enlighten readers, obviously, to the fact that life has inherent struggles, and they allow us to feel pain and to connect in really graceful and beautiful ways through their art. However, I am concerned that the accumulation of all this type of literature, of really challenging content and overwhelming toughness in reading these books, could eventually lead to teenagers kind of shouting, hooray, I never have to read again when they finish school. And I have heard that come out of, sadly, some students' mouths when they put down their pen of their last English paper. So we have a big survey in Australia for teenager wellbeing called the Nikki Australia Youth Survey. It's done every year, and it's the largest of its type in Australia. It found that teenagers felt less positive about their future in just 2 years. That dropped from 55% to 50% in 2022. And as you see there, nearly 29% of students reported they felt significant levels of psychological distress. Our students are also quite lonely. It's something that concerns me deeply. Certainly there were pockets of loneliness before the pandemic, but this has really increased, with my school noticing increased issues with particularly friendship issues and alienation, and more students self-identifying as lonely. And it's not limited to our school, it seems. Again, the same survey found that almost a quarter of young people, that's Australians aged between 15 and 19, felt lonely some of the time, or really sadly, all of the time. And I wondered if reading somewhat more light-hearted literature might be an antidote to some of my concerns. As Edward de Bono says, humour is by far the most significant activity of the brain. And one of the lecturers at Queen Mary University said, far from being unserious, comedy is perhaps the best place to engage with the crises and controversies of the present moment. It allows us to develop series of frameworks for understanding our political, emotional and ethical possibilities, as well as the limitations. And as he says, humorous writers are never only joking. So I had this idea of the Light-Hearted Book Club. So I kind of pitched up to a Year 11 assembly and presented my ideas to a group of 16-year-old girls, explaining what I was hoping for from the group, and slightly worried that nobody would be interested in it, given the concerns I had about no one reading. However, 7 at the start, 7 beautiful souls came forward and said they'd like to be involved. So we had our first meeting, and it was a highly nervous one. I didn't know the students at all. They had just graduated into my area of the school. And upon checking with the girls, those 7 girls, only a few of them said they knew each other very well. Just for context, with the school that I teach at is a large school. There are about 290 girls in Year 11 alone. So we had our first meeting. We introduced ourselves, discussed the aims of the group, And I asked the girls to fill in a quick survey so I could get a kind of benchmark. And the responses confirmed some of my initial hunches. 4 of the 7 said they came forward to join the group to force themselves to find time to re-engage with a reading habit that they used to enjoy when they were younger. 3 said they knew they had to get better at reading and were hopeful that the books we were going to read would be more interesting than the stuff they got in class. Regarding their feelings of anxiety about the future, most articulated a bit of a mixed bag, with one student writing, "I feel both optimistic and concerned. My emotions change every day with the new information I absorb. I feel mostly optimistic and I'm really grateful for my position in a great school with strong friends and family, but it is easy to worry about the future." All respondents noted they were looking forward to making new friends, with one reflecting, "I hope we can share insights over these books and discover new connections we didn't have before." So we launched off with our first text, which was Jane Austen's Emma, written in 1815. By this stage, interestingly, another staff member had joined. She was a biology teacher who cited similar reasons. She wanted to read a bit more and was looking for a good laugh. So we chatted about Emma, and all except one student really enjoyed the book. They found it very funny and they understood the satire and related it quite effectively to people in their own context and ideas that still concern us. In my kind of nervous way, I had prepared quite a number of questions to direct the initial conversation, but it wasn't required. The girls really engaged with each other and really understood how Austen was using satire to laugh at human folly and correct it, rather than the nastiness and isolation that happens through social media. Most of the group went home that weekend to actually watch Clueless again, which is a remake of Emma, and they were quite amazed at how values and humour doesn't really change over time. Our next text was a short story by an Australian author called Trent Dalton, and it was an inverted experience of lost love, which switched from grief and resentment through to acceptance and appreciation. This was followed by another short story by a writer called David Sedaris. He is, if you haven't read his short stories, he's one of the funniest men on the planet. I'd really encourage you to read his work. I had to search quite a long time to find one which wasn't riddled with really bad language. But I did find one, and I explained that to the girls, and they went off to read some more. I think they wanted to get into the language. Anyway, they found the stories really, really funny in their silliness, and the particular one we looked at was called In the Waiting Room, where he was waiting in a doctor's surgery. And it led to a really interesting discussion about the humiliating memories we had and how we stored them in our brain and how we could reframe those as funny moments and learn to laugh at ourselves rather than shrink away from that personal humiliation for the rest of time. By the time of our third weekly meeting, our numbers had swelled to 12, which I took to mean the students were really enjoying it and bringing along their friends. Well, the next story was that storied life of AJ Fikri, which had been recommended by a college librarian. And somewhat strangely, in the story, there are 4 deaths, which sounds like it wouldn't be funny, but it's a story of strength and friendships and resilience, with very quirky characters and funny aside stories. It was a favourite among some, but some of the girls said they just couldn't keep up with reading a text per week. So it was confirmed that time is a factor. They're pretty busy young people. So we reconvened and replanned, and instead of reading a book a week, which I thought was quite reasonable, we changed that to 1 book every 3 weeks. However, the girls still wanted to meet every week, which was really interesting. I took that to mean they were really enjoying the social aspect of making new friends. So they'd come along and talk about what they had read so far and just chat about what had happened in their week, I guess. We finished off the term with 2 classics, Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest and Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which one of the girls had suggested themselves. They both prompted really more discussion about the authors themselves. The girls were really interested in those writers and how they were using their text to make comment on their own world. Somewhat surprisingly to me, the favourite out of all of them was Oscar Wilde's Importance of Being Earnest. They found the play very funny and farcical, and most had already read his very dark portrait or picture of Dorian Gray and were interested in how he could transcend the 2 genres, a bit like Roald Dahl, I suppose. So we finished up the term And my evidence for the project as it finished after 14 weeks is all pretty qualitative. The success of the project I'm putting down to the growth in student participation and also the fact that the girls want to continue. This book club will live and thrive beyond the confines of our research project. At the conclusion of the term, we were up to 15 students and 2 staff, which is almost getting too big, most of whom were keen to continue reading into the future. Even though some had not completed the reading for each week, they still turned up and listened to the conversation and participated where they could. And again, that indicated to me the value of the social element. And there was no, consequence if they didn't read. They were just invited to come along. My aim now is to get in the ear of the head of English and try and get some of this literature back into the actual curriculum in year 11 and 12. And I think some people are worried that light-hearted literature is kind of an intellectual lightweight, but comedy is not a dumbing down of the curriculum. To analyse humour, I think, is actually much more sophisticated than to analyse tragedy. So studies show that changes in brainwaves in response to punchlines are like those when we notice rare, intriguing events which capture our attention and they focus us highly. And as I've said before, good humour should and must accomplish something more than entertainment. It really teaches us to laugh at ourselves and our idiocy and the challenges we face in life. And when we look back through history, we can see, right through some of the darkest times of human history, writers have used their craft to get people through the dark times. Interestingly, in our discussions as the term wore on, we had more deep discussions about the place of comedy in art and literature specifically, and why that was important to the human spirit. And we all agreed that, it's pretty easy to agree on what's tragic and what's sad. So there's a really common bonded experience when you're reading a tragic story. But what's funny is deeply personal and sometimes almost impossible to explain. And if you have to explain the joke, it effectively kills it. So it kind of just lives in its own moment. This made for really lively and interesting discussion around the group. With different aspects of the books appealing to us in different ways. We'd often bring our favourite quotation as part of the practice or the character, and we rarely agreed with what we enjoyed. So next term, we're going back with our 14 students and just curating our list for our next term, which covers a lot of territory. We've got a non-English speaker included here this time, an older text with Jonathan Swift's Modest Proposal, and then the classic Catch-22 and a relatively modern text of Ben Elton's Dead Famous, a really funny story about reality TV. So when I was doing my research, I found this quote from a fellow called John Agard, who said, "Humour breaks down boundaries, topples self-importance, it connects people, and because it engages and entertains, it ultimately enlightens us." And that's what I've found through personal experience and what the girls have reported back. Just at the end of my presentation, I'd like to thank Ian for being my mentor. We've had some great questions presented to me and some wicked problems and solutions to work through, which I've really enjoyed. I've looked forward to our meetings immensely, despite the fact, poor Ian, I'm really terrible with time frames. So often he would be like, "Are you there? Are you there?" And I was like, "Oh, I thought it was in an hour's time," but we always made it somehow. And I thank you for your patience and your wisdom and your guidance, Ian. It's been a real joy. Unfortunately, my partner, who I was paired up with at the beginning of the project, April Wilcox from the US, couldn't carry on. However, we're still in touch and hopefully building an exchange between the two schools. So something good has come out of that connection as well. So thank you for listening. And if you've got students in your school who you'd like to connect in with my lighthearted literature group, I'm pretty confident my girls would love to chat to other students around Australia or across the world. Thanks.
Nikki, thank you so much. It's applause. Yeah. I put a question in the chat, but before I get to that, you mentioned Edward de Bono, and years ago I had the good fortune to work with him, and he has done a very clever thing in analysing why a joke is funny, and it looks a bit like a railway track. So if you imagine that you're telling a joke and you think you're heading for the end of the railway track, but then you hit a set of points or what do you call points in America, where it goes off to one side? It's not points, it's something else. So in other words, you change direction. And what happens is that you end up in a place that you didn't expect, but you can see why it's funny. So I'll give you an example by reference to a clean, I hope, Clinton joke. The Clintons were out driving in their car one day, and they came to a gas station, and they filled up with petrol. And as they were, talking, Bill noticed that Hillary was talking to the gas station attendant, and they drove away. And Bill said rather smugly, "There you are. If you'd have married him, you'd be the wife of a gas station attendant." And she says, "He would have been president of the United States." And you can see sort of how that happens and why it makes you laugh, because it's an unexpected jump from the start of the story. And I think I'm safe in telling that in this setting, at least I hope so. Nikki, I had a question about, I know we didn't profile your students on the book club, at least we haven't yet, but from your gut feel, what would be your sense of their colour energies? Would they be sort of in a common place, or would they be in a different place, or how do you see it?
I think the majority of them would be in a similar place. Some of them were in that quite social, kind of emotional, I guess it's the yellow kind of colour, I think. One of them was highly analytical. She's a girl who's on the spectrum, and she just hated the Jane Austen book. She absolutely said they're just wandering around visiting houses. What's funny about that? But so it was great to have the discussion, and she's the one who liked The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So look, I think there'd be a bit of a scattering, but a lot in that kind of connecting group. But pretty lonely, some of them. The heads of year had a look at the girls who put their name forward, and they were actually quite startled at some of the students who came forward who were quite disengaged from school in some cases, or they just didn't expect them to be involved. So it's been an interesting project. You're muted, Ian.
Sorry. Gemma, can I come to you? We've been talking a bit about research and work that I'm hoping Gemma's going to be helping us with going forward in Brightfield. This feels, Gemma, like a sort of an under-researched area in sort of the literature, if I can put it that way. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested in this. So I'm a big reader myself. The first thing I want to say, Nikki, is there is a bit of a juxtaposition between how you market it. You're calling it like this light-hearted reading club, and I understand it's all humorous, but oh my gosh, the stuff that you're getting the kids to read, like that's no mean feat there. So you're actually getting them like catch-22. That's amazing at a school level. So I know that you spoke about how your data was with the qualitative side of it, and I'm kind of excited at the prospects of what you could do with this. So pre and post tests, having a look at different aspects from either that kind of NAPLAN side or English literature and language. If you could, as you said, get the ear of your head of English, like what is the actual impact of what they're doing. So even vocabulary, I think there's a lot of issues with literature snobbery. And really kids should just be reading whatever. Read the IKEA catalogue as far as I'm concerned. Like just read whatever. I just don't care. And so maybe having a look at the improvement in vocabulary once a part of that. But then what you've just spoken about, I think, is possibly even more interesting, like giving these kids a safe space, essentially. So I was that child that was horrendously bullied in school, and I found myself in the library. And that's how I became that, voracious reader, just tucking myself in the corner and just read. So I think there is a lot of scope of what I'm going to be talking about later on is action research, and just the fact that we are experts in our field, and yet we never publicize our work. And I think you could really get some concrete evidence of the impact that you're having, because I think it's hugely, hugely exciting.
Oh, thank you. We were actually using we had actually been using a program called IARN, where the girls were self-assessing their well-being before that. So I was going to get them to use that to benchmark, and then the school pulled out of that partnership, which was a bit of a shame given the timing. However, yeah, I think it's fascinating, and they are tough books. You know, they are tough books, and the girls haven't shied away from them. I see Heather's comment that the girls want to watch the film versions. They kind of rushed home. We actually agreed on the last week to watch a little bit of The Importance of Being Earnest, but then I was away sick, so I think they went ahead and did that anyway without me. And it's actually coming to a stage show in Sydney in September, and I'm thinking I'll take the girls along as a little excursion one night to just watch the actual play in action. So yeah, it's been a really delightful thing, and I'd love to get further into the research actually, because it's been something that's been on my mind for many years, and I've never really got going with it. And this is a very small sample of girls, so yeah.
Heather?
No, that is, I think, one of the things that I would expect to happen if you start using, you know, these sorts of amazing texts, which obviously are all available in film or TV series or whatever. But I'm pleased that they all agreed not to in the beginning. I also, you quoted Mark Twain at the beginning, and I think Mark Twain is a brilliantly funny writer with such a deep, strong, and important story to tell. And that's another one. But I wonder whether there is any desire among the girls to go for something a lot less deep and meaningful and just plain funny. I'm trying to think of some of the books, because I read endlessly, and I love disaster and tragedy, but then I also really enjoy the humor, and I go to a lot of stand-up comedy, so you could maybe some brilliant stand-up.
Some of the work of David Mitchell or Greg Davies.
Ben Elton is great, actually. He's got all his books are hilarious.
I gave them some YouTube clips to watch again. I did the caveat with Billy Connolly. The language is going to be a little bit but just the observations about life, and I do think that's how we get along as humans. Without humour, we'd be in a sticky place, and we seem to have just lost it a little bit. I guess because it can veer into the offensive sometimes too, which is difficult to chart that. So we did have a little bit of a discussion about that when things aren't funny, and you kind of, I guess the girls just said, well, you just switch it off.
So been lots of other comments. Elizabeth, oh, sorry, Heather. Yeah.
I just want to add one on this issue of Sonjo.
I just want to add one on this issue of Sonjo offended. It's probably we don't get into this too much now, but in days of cancel culture, to learn, listen to jokes that are a bit offensive and not be offended, it's not personal. I think the more you can introduce that to people younger, get them that this is okay, and there is a balance, but the balance isn't zero.
Yeah. And I think often that the jokes that appear to be a little bit offensive, actually mocking the bigot, and it gets misunderstood as that's their voice rather than they're mocking.
Yes.